It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, well, we thought the week that's in it, it would be appropriate to take a look at a classic hand from the World Series of Poker. Well, what is more iconic than the hand dubbed Bluff of the Century when Chris Moneymaker got Sammy Farha to lay down the winner heads up for the World Championship in 2003? To help us look at what, in retrospect, is some funky play, we are joined by Daiva Byrne. Daiva, welcome.
Hello, and thanks for having me, guys.
Well, listen, we'll get into the hand. The blinds were 20, 40 and 5k ante. God, imagine being at the final table heads up for the World Series and the blinds being that low these days. Moneymaker had 4.6 million and Farha had 3.7. Moneymaker makes this 100k, 2.5x with the King of Spades, 7 of Hearts, and Farha calls with the Queen of Spades, 9 of Hearts. So going to the flop, we have 210k in the pot. So far, so good, but the wheels do come off this hand pretty quickly. The flop comes down, the 9 of Spades, 2 of Diamonds, 6 of Spades, and it goes check, check. Dara, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I think everything in the hand so far is reasonably standard. Pre-flop is certainly standard. Moneymaker should be raising a lot on the button, and this is an above average hand, so he raises. Farha should be three-betting some really strong hands and some weak hands for value, and then calling a lot as well, and this kind of fits into the middle, so he just calls. On the flop, Farha flops top pair, but he has the sort of more condensed range, so he shouldn't really be leading, so he checks. I think that's perfectly standard. Moneymaker could probably go either way with his hand. This isn't a board he can bet all the time, because if we think about his range pre-flop, he's probably raising close to 100%, but not quite 100%. And the part that's missing are going to be a lot of hands that have 6x and 2x in them. It's probably about 50-50 in terms of who hits this board better. So he can't always bet it. And with his specific hand, King of Spades, 7, he has backdoor flush draw with the King of Spades. He has some backdoor straight draws as well. But he also crucially has showdown. And the fact that he has showdown means he can check this hand. If you think about Farha, like, he'll only have hit a pair 30% of the time on this board. He won't have started with a better hand than King 7 all that often either. So actually King 7 figures to be the best hand most of the time. I think he could also bet the hand though. It's useful to fold out equity. And also there are a lot of good turn cards. He can turn a flush draw or a straight draw and think about barreling far off a stronger hand.
Yeah, that makes an awful lot of sense. Daiva, just turn to you there. It's very hard, I suppose, 16 years later to put yourself in their shoes, but theoretically Farha was the stronger player, the more experienced player. I know maybe he would be seen as a little fishy in some of the high stakes game even back then, but up against an amateur like Moneymaker, he certainly would have fancied his chances. For that reason, do you think him taking sort of a more passive line pre-flop certainly makes sense, because he would want to, maybe as an overall strategy, keep the pots as small as possible, figuring he could kind of small ball Moneymaker?
Yeah, for sure. I think you in general want to play hands more passively out of position, but also especially when we are so deep and there's no point inflating the pot, with a medium kind of hand. It's not that strong, it's not that it has a set or, 2 pair. I tend to agree with Dara on this, that pre-flop and flop is pretty much standard in this hand. Both players got enough showdown.
Absolutely. Well, the turn comes the 8 of Spades, probably the most interesting card possible for Moneymaker. He sort of hit his nut draw card, but very interestingly, Farha leads out with a 300k bet. That's 1.5x pot. Now, with top pair, obviously a vulnerable enough top pair as well on such a straighty board and a flushy board, you might be inclined to make a bet and charge your opponent to draw, but 300k is a big bet here. Daiva, I'll start with you this time. When you face an overbet of this size and you have such a monster draw, you can kind of go both ways, can't you?
Yeah, so obviously Farha should be leading on the turn. He's got top pair, he wants to bet for value and, a little bit for protection, but I think even if he bet half of what that would achieve the same result. And when it comes to Chris, I think he should call rather than raise, because he ended up raising, 3 times to 900, because I think his hand is basically a hand too strong to turn into a bluff.
Yeah, having the position advantage is crucial here, Dara, because while he's not getting the direct odds, having to pay 300k, the overbet in this case, he does definitely have some implied odds, because there's a good chance he'll get paid off a bet on the river if he hits his hand.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's also possible he's still ahead. I mean, Farha can be bluffing with the worst draw after the flop has gone check, check. So I don't think raising makes a lot of sense here. As a general rule, when we're facing over bets, we should be raising a lot less anyway. I mean, if Farha now shoves, we are probably going to have to call off. We're probably just about getting the right price, but it's not a great spot for us. Probably getting it in with 40% equity. I think Daiva nailed it when she said this hand is too strong a draw to bluff with right now. And if we don't bluff with it now, we can still bluff the river. If we miss, we're still in position. So we have more than one way to win the pot. We don't just have to hit. I don't think it's a terrible raise, but I think calling is definitely better.
Yeah, I suppose the thing that I'm most fascinated about, again, is trying to transport myself into 2003 Chris Moneymaker's brain. And I'm thinking to myself, well, maybe he just wanted to blow any pot he knew he had decent equity in. Like, they will often be good advice to an amateur player up against a better player that, well, as soon as you know you're in a spot where you can't be too far behind, bloat that pot because you're just upping the luck factor. Daiva, do you think that played into Chris's thinking here?
Maybe. I think, to be honest, when he raised, I think he already had a plan to shove the river, regardless of the card most of the time. I think probably maybe not shove on a paired board, but I think there are so many good cards for him. Like, he can shove for value, if spade comes or, if a straight gets there. And also there is just like so many brick cards he can shove representing made straights himself because he's got 7. So I think literally by raising, he already made a decision to bluff this hand, just go for it and pull the trigger.
Yeah, so in this situation, Moneymaker does raise it up to 800k. And Farha calls. So I guess Farha may be slightly disbelieving that he's up against a made hand because perhaps with a flush draw on the flop, he expects Moneymaker to have c-bet. That makes some sense. I guess 7-10 is a very likely hand because perhaps Moneymaker is now sort of raising it up, fearing the flush draw that could be in Farha's hand. And Farha, again, going to be sticky here because he's conscious of that. Dara, when you see this spot now and this incredibly inflated pot, we got 1.8 million if he makes the call here, and we're certainly looking at potentially stacks going in by the river. It does seem like a huge overplaying of both their hands at some level. Do you think once Farha sort of makes the call here on the flop, which he does, he sort of made his bed for maybe a big decision on the river?
Yeah, I think if I'm in Farah's spot here now on the turn, I would first of all be regretting the fact that I'd made this massive overbet. It's kind of the way people played back then. When they wanted you to fold, they bet big. But unfortunately, Moneymaker hasn't played ball and Moneymaker has raised. Obviously, our hand is far too strong to fold. And it's not even a particularly big raise. I think he raised from 300 to 800. So we're getting incredible pot odds. So really, we should only be folding our absolute bluffs to this sizing. But it is going to put us into a really tricky situation on the river now, where we're probably going to have to check 100% of the time and make a decision if Moneymaker bets.
I think back then it was all about bluffing. And, the more you bluff, the better player you are. We used to show all those hands, bluff hands on TV, whereas now we show like variety of hands, like not necessarily hands that win the pot, than bluffing. I'm
also curious if Moneymaker actually saw himself as the weaker player in this situation. You said that maybe that's why he's bloating pots. From reading interviews with Chris since, I have to say I don't really get that sense. Like, Chris played a fair amount online before he went out there. And even if he didn't have much live experience, I don't think he would necessarily have seen himself as a fish.
He looks very confident in that hand. If you watch live video, he actually, to me personally, he comes across more confident than Farha. And I would think he's a more experienced player.
Yeah, I agree with that. He looks incredibly relaxed considering what a balls out bluff this is in the end, which presumably helps sell it to Farha.
Well, he certainly put himself in a tough spot here because I do feel in Farha's shoes now going to the river. We don't know if we want to catch a card or not. We're really in a dark tunnel here. A spade could, make us the best hand, but it also could put us behind. A brick could be exactly what we want because our opponent's on a big draw, or it's exactly the problem card. That means we maybe have to call when we're behind at this point and then again on the river. So it's a really, really dark tunnely spot. But anyway, we do go to the river. It's the 3 of hearts. That looks like a super brick. Farha does check, as you said, Dara. He can't really have any leads in this spot. Even if he was to make, trips or something like that, he just can't ever value it, I don't think, in this spot. And Chris Moneymaker, well, we did say it was the bluff of the century. He goes all in for 3.7 million, effectively 2.8 million. And Farha put to the ultimate test. First reactions, Dara?
This is a horrible spot now for Farha. He's basically bluff catching. And so it purely comes down to a decision on whether he thinks Moneymaker is bluffing or not. Back then, people didn't really think in terms of ranges and distributions and bluff catching with certain parts of their range that made good bluff catches and folding with others. But if you think about it, Moneymaker is basically polarized now to a straight or better. He's either made his straight on the turn or his flush on the turn. I don't think he should even be shoving 2 pairs or sets on this board. So if Farha is sitting there with any hand that's worse than a straight, whether it's a set, two pairs or a pair, they're all essentially the same value. They're beating the bluffs and they're not beating the value hands that Moneymaker is shoving. So from a game theory point of view, he has to decide whether he has a good bluff catcher, and he actually has a good bluff catcher, given that he has a spade in his hand. For example, I think calling with a hand like 10-6 here with the 10 of spades, that's actually a better call than, say, calling with two pairs, say 9-8, but no spades, because with 10-6, you're blocking the flushes that Chris can have. Farha himself said afterwards that he tanked for 20 minutes. Now, Moneymaker thinks it wasn't quite that long, but whatever the case, he definitely tanked for longer than appears on the footage and eventually did decide to fold. So he clearly decided that Moneymaker just wasn't bluffing in this specific instance. Looking back, it looks like a very bad fold. I mean, top pair on this board where so many draws miss is a really strong hand. The fact he has a spade in his hand makes it an even better bluff catcher.
Yeah, well, Daiva, I always think of you as a great reader of people, and obviously we still have the original footage there. I've heard those inconsistent stories as well about it being like 3 or 4 minutes of a tank and it about being 15 to 20 minutes of a tank. I don't know which one is true, but regardless, Farha did give himself a chance to make a read. He did study Moneymaker for a little while. He also glances down at his chips a lot, not looking for a read 100% of the time, which could be a mistake or could be just, I guess, him going through his own process of decision making. When you watch the VT, do you feel like Chris gives away anything? Do you feel like maybe Farha's not looking for the right physical information and there is something out there for him to find?
I mean, the video I saw, it was like a brief version, you know, like a shorted one of the original hand, I assume, because it was certainly not 20 minutes. I can't even imagine what it's like sitting there for 20 minutes when you know you're bluffing. The longest time when I was bluffing, it was like 4 minutes. And I seriously thought the world is ending. Like literally the sky is falling down on me. But from what I've seen looking in this specific hand and with Chris, I thought he looked super confident and he was, like Dara said, very relaxed. And it definitely screamed strength, but at the same time, he made his decision to move all in pretty quickly. And that's usually a sign of a weaker hand or a bluff because people don't think enough about how much value they can extract from a worse hand.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that analysis. So actually, just for the fun of it, I know you guys did a PO analysis. Daiva, what happens if both players play solver approved poker? I'm guessing that maybe like 3 big blinds get into this pot.
So yeah, I think flop goes check, check, and with turn, Farha should lead, but in a smaller sizing. And Chris Moneymaker should just flat. And on the river, Farha should bet 2/3 of the pot. And Chris Moneymaker should fold most of the time, between 80 and 90%. And sometimes he should go for it.
Okay, so in most cases, there's going to be 6 or 7 big blinds in there. And actually, it's not the memorable hand, the famous hand that we all know. And then maybe occasionally Chris Moneymaker gets the same sort of idea in his head, goes for the big bluff, and maybe in a similar way we get that excitement. Dara, turn it back to you maybe for the last word. That moment in poker history, if you like, it'll be remembered forever. Obviously, Chris Moneymaker is credited with starting the poker boom. Maybe every amateur sitting at home who used to watch the World Series every year suddenly saw one of their own, you know, an accountant who'd satellited in for $80 and was sitting there with the best in the world, and he'd knocked out Ivy on the second last table, admittedly with a bit of good fortune, but there he was living the dream, and there he was doing maybe the thing that people aspire to the most or sensationalize the most, which is pulling off a huge bluff when it really matters.
Yeah, I think it was the perfect storm. The fact that he'd satellited in online at a time where people were wary of online poker and weren't sure what its place in the overall scheme of things for poker was. The fact that he was essentially an amateur against what many people saw as a pro. And, you know, he had the perfect name as well, Moneymaker. It was a name written for headlines. It basically sold the idea that you could get to the World Series for very small investment and you could actually pull off a win. Looking back now, we identify it as the moment that kickstarted the online boom.
Yeah, well, kudos to Chris Moneymaker. He got the fold from Sammy Farha, still a PokerStars pro to this day. Of course, now also a World Series Hall of Famer. And I guess for very good reason, he's still symbolic of that poker dream. Well, listen, thank you so much, Dara O'Kearney, for your analysis. Thank you so much, Daiva Byrne.
Thank you, and the same to you guys.